Don Rickles could make anyone laugh. Presidents, movie stars, and even Frank Sinatra. But his most unforgettable stage partner was Johnny Carson. Night after night, their chemistry lit up The Tonight Show. And to the world, it looked like a friendship built on laughter and trust. Yet when Carson walked away from late night in 1992, everything changed. What Rickles thought he was promised never came true, and the bitterness that followed would haunt him for years. Before his death, Rickles finally revealed the truth about Johnny Carson that few could have imagined. Don Rickles' rise to fame. Comedy has always been about timing, delivery, and making people laugh when they least expect it. And in the golden age of television, two men stood at the very top of that world, Johnny Carson and Don Rickles. Both of them, in their own way, changed comedy forever. On screen, they looked like best friends, constantly teasing each other and making America laugh night after night. But the truth behind their relationship was far more complicated. And before his death, Don Rickles finally opened up about what it was really like. Don Rickles, the man who could insult anyone, from Hollywood royalty to political leaders, and somehow make them laugh harder than anyone else in the room, was born on May 8, 1926, in Queens, New York, to Jewish immigrant parents. Don grew up in the neighborhood of Jackson Heights, and inside his home, the Yiddish language and culture were part of daily life. Don once said that being Jewish shaped his sense of humor and his quick wit, and also gave him that sharp edge that audiences would eventually love. Like so many young men of his generation, Rickles' life was interrupted by World War II. At just 18 years old in 1944, he enlisted in the United States Navy and served aboard the USS Cyrene, a motor torpedo boat tender. Although he didn't see direct combat, the discipline and camaraderie of the Navy left a mark on him. It also gave him time to think about what he wanted from life once he returned home. When the war finally ended, Rickles already knew he wanted to be an actor. He enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York, one of the most respected acting schools in the country. He worked hard, hoping to land dramatic roles in film or television. But the truth was, acting work didn't come easily. He faced constant rejection, and the frustration started to build. Finally, in the early 50s, Rickles decided to try something different. He turned to stand-up comedy, not because he had the dream of being a comedian, but because it was a way to stay on stage, to perform, and to connect with an audience. At first, he tried standard jokes, but they didn't have the impact he was looking for. It wasn't until some hecklers interrupted his act one day that Rickles finally found his signature act. He snapped back at them with quick, cutting insults, but instead of offending the crowd, it brought the house down. People loved it. In fact, they laughed harder at his comebacks than at his rehearsed material. And that was the moment Don Rickles discovered his true gift. He leaned into this insult comedy style, perfecting it over time. His act wasn't about telling long stories or punchlines, it was about tearing into whoever was in the room. But it wasn't mean-spirited. That was the magic of Rickles. He could insult someone in the harshest way and still make them feel like they were in on the joke. That balance would define his entire career. One night in Miami Beach, that style changed his life forever. Sitting in the audience was none other than Frank Sinatra, the most powerful entertainer in the country. Rickles spotted him and didn't hesitate. He looked straight at Sinatra and said, "Make yourself at home, Frank. Hit somebody." The room erupted. Everyone knew Sinatra's reputation for toughness, but here was a young comedian daring to poke fun at him. Sinatra loved it, and just like that, he became Rickles' biggest supporter, spreading the word about him to his friends in show business. That endorsement opened the doors of Las Vegas. Rickles became a headliner, playing to packed crowds and earning the nicknames The Merchant of Venom and, ironically, Mr. Warmth. Those names captured the paradox of his act. Venom in delivery, but warmth in spirit. People came not just to laugh, but to be roasted by Don Rickles himself. From there, his television career took off. He was a frequent guest on talk shows like the Dean Martin Celebrity Roasts, where he would tear into celebrities of every background, from actors to politicians to even athletes, and somehow leave everyone smiling. But he wasn't just a stand-up star. Rickles also found success in television and film. He starred in the sitcom CPO Sharky in the late 1970s, and before that, he had The Don Rickles Show, a short-lived sitcom that still showcased his sharp timing. He also had roles in movies like Run Silent, Run Deep with Clark Gable and Burt Lancaster, proving he could handle serious acting when given the chance. And even in his later years, the recognition kept coming. In 2007, he won an Emmy Award for the documentary Mr. Warmth, The Don Rickles Project, which celebrated his life and career. It was a fitting tribute to a man who had spent decades shaping comedy and influencing countless performers who came after him. But behind the laughs, the television appearances, and the friendships with Hollywood royalty, there was another side to Rickles' story that he rarely spoke about publicly. Rickles' hidden pain. Don Rickles built his career on laughter, but away from the spotlight, he carried a very different story. Audiences saw the quick comebacks, the big smile, and the endless energy. What they didn't always see was that Rickles had a private life filled with both joy and heartbreak. He had his moments of love, but there were also moments of deep personal loss. In 1965, Rickles' life changed when he married Barbara Sklar. He often joked that she was the one who made it possible for him to survive all those years in show business. Barbara wasn't just his wife. She became his anchor, and together they had 2 children, Mindy and Larry. Don loved being a father, though by his own daughter's account, he wasn't always the most openly expressive man at home. Mindy Rickles later described her father as deeply loving but emotionally guarded. She explained that Don could shower the world with jokes and laughter, but when it came to opening up about his deepest feelings, he held back. That was part of the hidden side of Rickles. The same man who could stand in front of 1,000 people and fearlessly roast a celebrity often struggled to put words to his own vulnerabilities within his family. However, she made it clear that despite this fact, he was the perfect father and husband. In her words, he was a very loving dad. He never insulted us. His son, Larry Rickles, followed a different path into entertainment. Larry became a writer and producer, and in 2007, he won an Emmy Award as part of the team behind Mr. Warmth, The Don Rickles Project. It was a proud moment for Don, who often said that his family's accomplishments meant more to him than his own. But just 3 years later, tragedy struck. In 2011, Larry died unexpectedly at the age of 41 from pneumonia. Don Rickles had made his entire career out of laughter, but losing a child was a pain that went far beyond words. Rickles was beyond devastated, and though he didn't talk about it publicly in detail, those close to him noticed a change. His humor remained, but there was a heavier layer beneath it. The loss of Larry was something he carried with him for the rest of his life. But it wasn't the only burden, because while Rickles loved his friendship with many stars, he wasn't immune to friendship disputes. Over the years, whispers and rumors surfaced that Rickles had complicated feelings toward Frank Sinatra, the same man who had once been responsible for launching him into stardom. Rickles never publicly confirmed all the rumors, but multiple reports claimed that he sometimes expressed resentment toward the singer. The most shocking part of these rumors came from allegations that Sinatra had a dark role in Marilyn Monroe's tragic story. According to these reports, Rickles believed that Sinatra had exploited Monroe in Hollywood. These were controversial claims, and while Rickles never made them openly in front of cameras, they left a lasting impact on his reputation in Hollywood circles. To the world, he was Mr. Warmth, the man who could insult anyone and get away with it. But within his own life, he carried grief, regrets, and opinions that didn't always fit the image people had of him. And yet, despite these private struggles, Rickles never let the audience see him falter. He always walked onto the stage with confidence, ready to unleash his sharp wit. But soon, another figure would enter his story in a way that would define much of his career. Johnny Carson, the king of late-night television, became both his greatest ally and his most complicated friend. On screen, their chemistry was undeniable, but behind the curtain, it was a relationship marked by more than just jokes. The Tonight Show era. When Don Rickles first walked onto the stage of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson in 1965, he had no idea that it would become one of the most defining platforms of his career. What began as a guest appearance quickly grew into a recurring role, not as a host or performer, but as the ultimate wild card. Over time, Rickles became one of Carson's most frequent visitors, racking up more than 100 appearances, and each one was unpredictable, unscripted, and unforgettable. The chemistry between Carson and Rickles worked because it was built on contrast. Johnny Carson was smooth, calm, and perfectly timed. He played the straight man better than anyone in television history. Rickles, on the other hand, was chaos, loud, brash, and never afraid to say the thing everyone else was too polite to even think. Together, they created magic. Audiences at home tuned in not just to hear Carson's monologues, but to see what would happen when Don Rickles was unleashed on his set. One of the most legendary moments happened in 1976. Carson was hosting The Tonight Show as usual when he went to grab a cigarette from his cigarette box on the desk, only to find it broken. The culprit? Don Rickles, who had appeared the night before while guest hosting. Without missing a beat, Carson did something rare for late-night television. He left the set during the show, walked across the hall to the studio where Rickles was filming his sitcom CPO Sharky, and barged in on live taping. The audience roared as Carson confronted him right there in front of everyone. Rickles tried to play innocent, then turned the whole thing into a comedy bit, pleading with Carson and joking that he was just trying to make a living. But the moment became iconic, a piece of television history that perfectly captured their chemistry. 2 years later, in 1978, Rickles once again stole the spotlight, this time during Carson's anniversary special. As the country tuned in to celebrate Carson's reign over late night, Rickles turned the event into one of his trademark roasts. He teased Carson about everything from his wealth to his multiple marriages, joking that Johnny changed wives the way most people changed cars. Carson, sitting there with his signature grin and cigarette in hand, let Rickles run wild. It was proof that Carson trusted him enough to take shots that few others could get away with. Rickles also thrived in physical comedy whenever he appeared on the show. One famous sketch involved Carson lying on a massage table during a comedy routine. Out of nowhere, Rickles stormed in and interrupted the scene. He threw himself into the bit, manhandling Carson and turning the calm setup into pure slapstick chaos. The audience erupted with laughter, and Carson, though trying to stay in character, couldn't help but crack up. The surprise appearances became part of Rickles' legend. He didn't just sit in the chair and answer questions, he turned every visit into an event. The teasing between the two was always sharp but affectionate. Rickles would needle Carson about his enormous wealth, calling him out for living like a king while pretending to be a man of the people. He joked about Carson's string of marriages, pretending to offer him advice on love while mocking his failures. And Carson, in turn, sat back, letting the insults bounce off him, playing the role of the cool, slightly exasperated straight man. The rhythm between them was so natural that it often felt less like a late-night interview and more like two old friends bantering at dinner. But behind the laughter, there was another side to The Tonight Show. Johnny Carson's control over the program was legendary. While he let Rickles run free on air, he maintained a tight grip on who got to sit in that guest chair. Many comedians and entertainers knew that Carson could make or break a career with a single invitation or a refusal to extend one. And some even feared his influence. Several high-profile incidents revealed just how powerful Carson was when it came to guest bookings. Joan Rivers, once his regular guest host and someone he had personally mentored, found herself permanently banned from The Tonight Show after she launched her own late-night program without informing him first. Carson never spoke to her again, and the ban lasted until after his death. Another case was impressionist Rich Little, who allegedly found himself blacklisted because Carson felt he was mocking him too often during performances. Even Rickles, who could get away with mocking Carson to his face, understood the boundaries. On camera, he was free to poke fun at Johnny's aloofness, teasing him for being stiff or overly serious. Off camera, though, Carson was known to be a very different man. Cold, distant, and often uninterested in forming friendships with his guests. Many celebrities who visited the show described Carson as polite but detached once the cameras were off. He rarely mingled backstage, and when the taping ended, he tended to retreat into his own world. This dynamic made Rickles' relationship with Carson unique. Unlike many other guests, Rickles could break through Johnny's shell, at least on stage. The audience loved it because they felt like they were seeing a side of Carson that no one else could reach. The laughter was genuine, and Carson's rare moments of being thrown off balance often happened only when Rickles was in the room. That chemistry became one of the enduring hallmarks of late-night television. But as much as the world loved their on-screen friendship, the truth behind Carson's smile was far more complicated. He wasn't just the king of late night, he was a man carrying private demons that few people ever saw. Carson's private demons. Behind Johnny Carson's calm smile and razor-sharp timing was a man who carried heavy demons. On television, he looked untouchable, the king of late night who kept America laughing. Away from the cameras, his life told a very different story, one filled with broken marriages, personal tragedy, and an almost relentless need for control. Carson was married 4 times, and nearly all of those relationships were marked by turmoil. His first marriage to Jody Wolcott ended in disaster, with Jody later describing violent outbursts and emotional maltreatment fueled by alcohol. What audiences saw as a charming host, Jody often saw as a man who could be unpredictable and frightening. Carson's temper, combined with drinking, created a volatile home life that couldn't last. His second marriage to Joanne Copeland wasn't much easier. Joanne spoke openly about Carson's drinking habits, describing episodes where he experienced blackouts and showed what she called tremendous anger about women. She revealed a side of Carson that few outsiders ever saw, a man whose insecurities often came out in destructive ways. The marriage, like the first, eventually crumbled under the weight of those private struggles. Even with all the success he achieved, Carson's personal life rarely seemed stable. He kept moving forward professionally, but behind the scenes, he struggled with trust, intimacy, and anger. Alcohol played a role, often intensifying the issues already bubbling beneath the surface. Each marriage seemed to follow a similar cycle of charm, conflict, and collapse. Carson also faced tragedy as a father. In 1991, his son Richard died in a car accident at the age of 39. Richard had been a photographer, and the accident happened while he was driving along the California coast. The loss was devastating, but Carson chose not to attend the funeral. His reasoning was that his presence would draw overwhelming media attention and turn a private family moment into a public spectacle. It was a decision that revealed just how much he wrestled with the divide between his public image and private grief. Despite being the most visible man in America every night, Carson was, at heart, an intensely private and reclusive person. He rarely attended Hollywood parties, avoided long conversations with guests once the cameras stopped rolling, and preferred to retreat into his own controlled environment. Those who worked with him often described him as shy, even withdrawn, once the spotlight was gone. He liked to be in charge of his surroundings, and his obsession with control extended to nearly every area of his life. Carson found unusual outlets to release some of his pent-up energy. Tennis became one of his favorite pastimes, a sport where discipline, focus, and control were essential. He also loved playing the drums, often retreating to practice as a way to channel his emotions. These hobbies gave him structure, a way to manage the parts of himself that seemed impossible to tame in relationships. The contradictions in Carson's life made him both fascinating and difficult to understand. He could make millions laugh with a single gesture on television, but at home, his marriages fell apart under the weight of his anger and detachment. He was adored by the public, yet reclusive in private, often retreating from even those closest to him. All of this added a complicated layer to his friendship with Don Rickles. On screen, Rickles poked fun at Carson's marriages, his wealth, and his aloofness. The audience saw it as comedy, but beneath those jokes was a grain of truth. It was part of what made their banter electric, but it also planted seeds of tension that would later lead to their own quiet fallout. Rickles' fallout with Carson. As much as Don Rickles and Johnny Carson entertained audiences with their on-screen chemistry, their friendship did not remain untouched by bitterness. By the time Carson retired from The Tonight Show in 1992, Rickles believed that his long history with the program and his undeniable connection with audiences made him a natural candidate to succeed him. To many, the idea of Rickles stepping into the late-night throne might have seemed unconventional, but to Rickles, it felt earned. That expectation never became reality. NBC handed the show to Jay Leno, a younger comedian with a very different style. Leno had built his reputation as a stand-up who appealed to middle America, with a safe and approachable presence that executives believed would keep ratings strong. Behind the scenes, the decision wasn't just about comedy. It was about business, demographics, and corporate strategy. But to Rickles, it was personal. The passing over reportedly left him with deep resentment. Friends and colleagues recalled that Rickles spoke harshly about Carson in private during those years, accusing him of betrayal. He reportedly called Carson a liar for leading him to believe that he stood a chance at the job. In Rickles' eyes, the man who had shared the stage with him for decades, who had laughed at his insults and brought him back to the couch again and again, had abandoned him at the very moment when the biggest opportunity was within reach. Rickles felt more than just disappointment. He believed that their friendship had been more performance than reality, built on appearances for television rather than genuine loyalty. While Carson's coldness off-camera was no secret in Hollywood, Rickles had always assumed their bond was different. Learning otherwise, or at least believing it to be so, was a wound that never fully healed. As Carson enjoyed his retirement, Rickles carried the bitterness with him. Though he continued performing, appearing on talk shows, and enjoying success well into his later years, the subject of Carson's retirement was one that stirred visible frustration. Insider reports said the resentment simmered quietly but persistently, shaping the way he reflected on his decades in entertainment. In public, Rickles continued to joke about Carson, keeping the old rhythm alive for audiences who remembered their heyday. Yet the playful barbs masked real anger. He often hinted that the relationship people saw on screen was more of a staged act than a personal friendship. The affection that appeared so genuine under the studio lights did not extend far beyond the cameras. As the years went by, Rickles' feelings toward Carson became less about rivalry and more about disappointment. The man who had been such a fixture in his career had ultimately left him feeling cast aside. When Carson's health began to decline in the early 2000s, Rickles still carried the weight of that fallout. Their bond, once a centerpiece of television comedy, had fractured, and what remained was an uneasy mix of admiration for Carson's talent and resentment over the way things ended. That complicated history made the moment of Carson's death in 2005 even more significant for Rickles. The world mourned the passing of the king of late night, but for Rickles, it was also the closing of a chapter filled with both laughter and unresolved pain. The end of an era. The night Johnny Carson signed off from The Tonight Show in 1992, he left with a grace that few entertainers ever achieve. But in the years that followed, his presence slowly faded from public view. Carson rarely gave interviews, hardly appeared on television, and chose to spend his final years in near-total privacy. By the early 2000s, the man who had once been America's nightly companion was living quietly, almost like a ghost of show business past. On January 23, 2005, that chapter finally came to an end. Carson died from complications of emphysema at the age of 79. The news hit the entertainment world like a thunderclap. Even though he had been retired for more than a decade, Carson's influence still hovered over late-night television, shaping every host who followed him. The loss felt like the closing of a cultural era, not just the passing of one man. The very next night, January 24th, The Tonight Show paid tribute to its former king. Jay Leno, who had inherited Carson's chair, stepped aside from his usual monologue-heavy format for the man who had built the house he now occupied. The episode brought together familiar faces from Carson's world, people who had laughed with him, worked beside him, and shared the stage during those unforgettable decades. Don Rickles was there, as was Bob Newhart and Carson's longtime sidekick Ed McMahon. Together, they celebrated not only Carson's career, but also his impact on comedy itself. Rickles, who had carried years of complicated feelings toward Carson, approached the tribute with surprising warmth. On ABC, he spoke candidly, calling Carson the best straight man a comedian could ever hope for. He added that Carson was a complicated genius, a phrase that perfectly captured the dual nature of the man, the brilliant host on stage and the distant figure in private life. It wasn't a sugar-coated farewell. Rickles didn't pretend their friendship had been flawless or that the tensions had never existed. Instead, he chose to honor Carson by recognizing both his gifts and his complexity. Coming from Rickles, who never shied away from honesty, it carried weight, showing that he still respected what Carson had accomplished. The tribute episode itself was a reminder of how deeply Carson's absence would be felt. Ed McMahon, who had spent 30 years by his side, spoke with the reverence of a man who had lost a partner, not just a boss. Bob Newhart, another titan of comedy, reflected on the countless nights when Carson's show served as the heartbeat of American culture. And Rickles, in his own way, reminded viewers that Carson's genius wasn't just in the jokes he told, but in the space he created for others to shine. For Rickles, the moment was bittersweet. He had spent decades needling Carson on air, poking at his marriages, his money, and his aloofness. Audiences had loved it, and Carson himself had seemed to relish it. But behind those laughs was always the sense that their friendship never quite reached the depth people imagined. Carson's death marked more than the end of a life. It marked the end of an era in entertainment. He had defined late-night television for 30 years, and even in retirement, no one could truly take his place. Every host who followed, from Leno to Letterman to Conan and beyond, stood in his shadow. And for Don Rickles, the loss was also personal. It was a reminder of his own mortality, of the fading generation of comedians who had once ruled American culture. Do you think Don Rickles should have been given the opportunity to host The Tonight Show? Tell us in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.